The storm came in heavy waves, rain pelting the windows of Umbravine, a secluded mountain town nestled between jagged cliffs and dense pine forests. Thunder rolled so deep it felt like the earth itself was groaning, and lightning flickered across the sky in jagged bursts. Daniel Grant stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the darkness that had swallowed the town. The storm should have passed by now. It had raged through the night, leaving the air damp and heavy, yet the blackness remained. The clock above the stove ticked past 7 a.m., but no trace of sunlight touched the horizon. It was a choking, consuming kind of dark, the kind that made even the warm glow of his kitchen seem frail. He could hear Lily stirring upstairs, her small footsteps padding across the creaky floorboards. "Dad?" Her voice, a trembling whisper, drifted down the staircase. "It's still night. Why is it still night?" Daniel checked his phone for the 100th time. Still no signal. The weather app was frozen, the screen refusing to load updates. Outside, the trees were silhouettes against a void. No wind stirred their branches. No birds broke the eerie silence. "Probably just a solar thing," he called back, trying to keep his voice steady. "You know, like an eclipse or something. Don't worry." His words tasted like a lie, even to him. By noon, the unease had spread like wildfire through Umbravine. The mayor called for an emergency town meeting at the old church, its towering steeple now barely visible against the unnatural gloom. Daniel bundled Lily in a coat and scarf, not because it was cold, but because the oppressive air felt wrong, thicker somehow, as if it carried a weight he couldn't see. Inside the church, the pews were packed. Familiar faces, neighbors, teachers, shopkeepers, sat shoulder to shoulder, their murmurs bouncing off the wooden rafters. At the pulpit, Mayor Stanton stood with Father Ellis, the latter clutching a worn Bible so tightly his knuckles were pale. "This is a rare weather phenomenon," Stanton began, his tone overly bright, like a kindergarten teacher pacifying a frightened child. "The storm last night disrupted the usual atmospheric, patterns, but there's no cause for alarm. We've sent messages to state authorities, and we expect to hear back soon." Someone in the crowd snorted. A wiry old man, Hal Briggs, raised a hand. "And how are you sending those messages? The phones are out, the damn radios too." The mayor faltered. "Backup methods," he said vaguely. Father Ellis stepped forward, his face ashen under the dim electric lights. "Perhaps we should be praying for guidance," he said, his voice shaking. "This could be a test of faith." Murmurs rose to a rumble, but Daniel didn't join in. He was too busy watching Mrs. Haddock. She sat alone in the back, her wiry gray hair unkempt, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. When she looked up, her eyes gleamed strangely, reflecting light where there should have been none. By the time Daniel and Lily returned home, the power had begun flickering. The weak overhead bulbs hummed like insects, casting long, jittery shadows across the walls. Daniel set Lily up in the living room with her favorite blanket and a flashlight, her small hands clutching it like a lifeline. "Don't move unless I come back, okay?" he said, kneeling beside her. "Where are you going?" she whispered. "Just to check on Mrs. Haddock," he lied. "Stay right here." The short walk to Mrs. Haddock's house felt endless. The streets were deserted, the silence oppressive. His flashlight's beam sliced through the dark, illuminating puddles of rainwater and the occasional stray leaf skittering across the ground. When he reached her yard, he froze. Mrs. Haddock stood at the edge of her property, facing the forest. Her hands hung limply at her sides, her head tilted slightly upward. She was murmuring again, her words low and guttural, like an incantation. "Mrs. Haddock," Daniel called softly. She didn't respond. He stepped closer, the beam of his flashlight trembling. Her lips moved faster now, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. The air around her seemed to shimmer, as if it were bending, warping in on itself. "Mrs. Haddock," Daniel shouted, grabbing her arm. She whipped around, her face inches from his. Her eyes glowed faintly, like a predator's caught in headlights, and her mouth curled into a grotesque grin. "It's in the dark, Daniel," she whispered. "The dark is alive." Before he could respond, she bolted, running toward the woods with an unnatural speed. Daniel shouted after her, but his voice felt swallowed by the surrounding blackness. Back home, Daniel locked the doors and shoved a heavy armoire against them. Lily was asleep on the couch, clutching her flashlight. He sat beside her, his heart pounding as he tried to make sense of the day. Was this some kind of mass hysteria, a shared delusion, or was it something worse? Outside, the scratching began. It was faint at first, like nails on glass. Then it grew louder, more insistent, dragging itself along the length of the house. Daniel grabbed a kitchen knife and edged toward the front door, careful not to wake Lily. The noise stopped. For a moment, the world was silent again. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate. Daniel peered through the peephole but saw only darkness, yet he felt it, something standing just beyond the door. The knob rattled once, then stilled. A low voice, raspy and inhuman, whispered from the other side, "Let me in." Daniel stumbled back, his breath hitching as the whispering began to multiply, voices overlapping like a broken symphony. He tightened his grip on the knife, his knuckles white. Then, silence. He didn't sleep that night. Neither did Umbravine. The morning brought no light, only a thicker, more oppressive gloom that felt like a blanket draped over the entire town. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the knife in his hands. He hadn't slept, his ears still straining for the faint whispers that had haunted him through the night. Lily was awake too, pale and quiet, her usual chatter replaced by uneasy silence. "I heard them too," she finally whispered. Her small voice startled him, making him glance up. Outside, they were talking, but I couldn't understand the words. Daniel forced a smile, though his hands shook. "It's probably just animals, sweetheart. Something in the woods." But she wasn't looking at him anymore. Her eyes were fixed on the window, her small body rigid. "Dad, there's someone standing outside." Daniel approached the window with slow, deliberate steps, gripping the knife tightly. At first he saw nothing, just the faint reflection of his face in the glass, lined with exhaustion and fear. But then a shadow shifted. A figure stood near the edge of the yard, barely visible against the void of the forest. It was tall and motionless, its head tilted slightly, as though studying the house. Its eyes reflected light like Mrs. Haddock's, glowing faintly, a sickly yellow-green. It wasn't moving, but Daniel had the distinct, stomach-churning feeling it was aware of him. "Stay here," he whispered to Lily, though every fiber of his being screamed against stepping outside. The cold hit him like a wall as he opened the door, his flashlight slicing through the inky black. The figure remained still, unnaturally so, like a mannequin left to weather the elements. As he stepped closer, he called out, his voice cracking, "Hey, who's there?" No answer, He advanced a few more steps, the beam of his flashlight catching something odd about the figure's face, or lack of it. Its features were smooth, almost melted, with only indentations where a mouth and nose should be. Those glowing eyes tracked him, unblinking. Then, with a sound like branches snapping, it turned and sprinted into the woods, disappearing faster than Daniel's flashlight could follow. The emergency siren blared at noon, a hollow wail that seemed to drag the remaining townsfolk from their homes like moths to a flickering bulb. Daniel took Lily, bundled tightly in her jacket, to the main square, where a group had already formed beneath the dim glow of streetlights. Mayor Stanton stood on the steps of Town Hall, his voice barely rising over the low murmur of the restless crowd. "It's clear this situation is unprecedented," Stanton began, his polished tone cracking under the weight of fear. "We've requested emergency aid, but without communication, it's only a matter of time before help arrives." "Help?" Hal Briggs barked from the back. "Help isn't coming. Something's wrong with this town, and you know it." Father Ellis stepped forward, clutching his Bible tightly. "This is no act of nature," he said, his voice trembling. "We've forsaken the light, and now the darkness has claimed us." The words sparked outrage, the crowd breaking into panicked arguments. Daniel hung back, holding Lily close, scanning the faces for anything unusual. It didn't take long to notice the changes. Mrs. Haddock was there, her eyes glowing faintly beneath her hood, her lips twitching with barely restrained whispers. Sheriff Miles stood by the edge of the group, his posture stiff, his jaw clenched too tightly. Even familiar faces, like the bakery owner, old Mr. Gill, seemed subtly wrong. Their movements were jerky, their expressions distant, as though their bodies were occupied by something else. "They're changing," Daniel muttered to himself, his grip tightening on Lily's hand. By nightfall, Umbravine fractured into two groups, those who clung to their humanity, desperate to make sense of the unending dark, and those who embraced it. The latter called themselves the Children of the Night, their whispers spreading like a virus through the streets. They spoke of a coming transformation, of surrendering to the Mother of Shadow. Daniel kept the lights on in his house, though they flickered constantly now. Lily sat in the living room, drawing with crayons. Her pictures were strange, twisted trees, eyeless faces, and a towering figure draped in black. "Who's that?" he asked, pointing to the figure. "The Shadow Lady," Lily said simply. "She says we don't need the sun anymore." Daniel's blood ran cold. When did she say that? "In my dream last night." She paused, her crayon hovering over the page. "But I think it wasn't a dream. I think she was here." That night the whispers returned, louder than ever. Daniel sat in the kitchen, knife in hand, the lights dimming and flaring unpredictably. He could hear movement outside, soft footsteps circling the house, the occasional scrape against the walls. He bolted upright when Lily screamed. Rushing into the living room, he found her blanket discarded on the floor, the flashlight rolling in slow circles. The front door stood wide open, the cold air pouring in. "Lily," he shouted, his voice cracking as he searched the house. No answer. Her drawings lay scattered across the floor, each one depicting the same shadowy figure. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. The forest loomed ahead, an impenetrable wall of black. Faintly, almost imperceptibly, he heard her voice, soft, distant, calling from the trees. "Daddy, come find me." He hesitated. the knife trembling in his hand. He knew something was wrong. He knew it wasn't really her. But as the whispers rose around him, overlapping and pulling at the edges of his mind, he took the first step into the woods, and then another, until the dark swallowed him whole. Daniel's flashlight barely cut through the suffocating black as he stepped deeper into the forest. The air was colder here, still and heavy, as though sound itself was being devoured. His heart thundered in his chest, the rhythmic pounding the only thing tethering him to reality. He heard Lily's voice again, faint and trembling, as though carried by the wind. "Daddy, I'm scared. Please." The sound pulled him forward, but the forest seemed alive, shifting around him. The trees loomed taller with each step, their twisted branches like skeletal hands reaching for him. His breath clouded in the frigid air, but there was no breeze, no movement, only the faint crunch of his boots on damp soil and the growing weight of the dark. He stopped when he saw the first sign. A torn scrap of Lily's jacket caught on a low branch. His trembling hand reached for it, the fabric damp and cold, as though it had been soaked in the dark itself. Beneath it, etched into the bark of the tree, was a symbol, a spiral encased in jagged lines. It pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat, and the sight of it made his stomach churn. The whispers grew louder, voices overlapping in a language Daniel couldn't understand. They slithered into his ears, a cacophony of guttural chants and pleading cries. The forest opened into a clearing, bathed in a pale, unnatural glow that seemed to come from nowhere. In the center stood a circle of townsfolk, their faces blank and eyes glowing. They swayed in unison, hands raised toward a towering figure at the clearing's center. Nixara. The entity loomed impossibly tall, her form a writhing mass of shadow that shifted constantly, as though the darkness itself was alive. Her face was a jagged, ever-changing mask of voids and cracks, with two piercing orbs of light where eyes should have been. Tendrils of blackness snaked out from her body, curling around the townsfolk like roots feeding on their humanity. At her feet knelt Lily. Her small frame was pale, her hair matted, and her eyes flickered faintly with the same unnatural glow as the others. Her lips moved silently, mimicking the chant of the circle. "Lily!" Daniel shouted, his voice breaking as he rushed forward. The chanting stopped abruptly. The figures turned in unison, their glowing eyes locking onto him. Nixara tilted her head, her form elongating as if to inspect him closer. The silence was suffocating, the air heavy with malevolence. "She belongs to the night," Nixara's voice rasped, echoing like wind through a canyon. It wasn't a voice meant for human ears. It clawed at Daniel's mind, leaving a sharp ache behind. "And so will you." Daniel didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing Lily's arm, but the moment he touched her, pain exploded through his body. The shadows wrapped around him, curling over his limbs, pulling him toward Nixara. His mind reeled as images flooded his vision, visions of Umbravine consumed by eternal darkness, of its people transformed into hollow, eyeless beings who served the Shadow Mother. He saw himself among them, his face blank, his hands drenched in darkness. "No," he thought, clutching Lily tighter. "This isn't real. I won't let this happen." The tendrils tightened, dragging him closer to Nixara's writhing form. She loomed over him, her eyes glowing brighter, her voice a jagged whisper. "You cannot resist the night." With a surge of desperation, Daniel pulled the shard of glass from his pocket, the one he'd broken from the picture frame at home. It was small and jagged, but when he thrust it into the tendril around his arm, the shadow recoiled with a screech. Nixara staggered back, her form flickering, and the chanting townsfolk collapsed like puppets with cut strings. Daniel grabbed Lily and ran. Her small body was limp in his arms, her skin cold and clammy, but he didn't stop. The forest seemed to resist him, the trees bending and twisting to block his path, but he pushed through, his flashlight flickering and dying as he neared the edge. Daniel burst out of the forest, collapsing onto the damp ground with Lily in his arms. He looked back, expecting to see Nixara following, but the woods were still, silent, as if nothing had ever happened. The sky above remained an unbroken sheet of black. No stars, no moon, no hope. He carried Lily back to the house, locking every door and window behind them. She stirred faintly, her glowing eyes dimming until they looked almost normal. Almost. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I'm here," he said, holding her tightly. "I've got you." But the darkness outside remained, heavier than before. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. It pressed against the house like a living thing, waiting, watching. When Daniel glanced at his reflection in the window, he saw it, his own eyes, faintly glowing in the dark. That night, Lily drew again, her hands shaking as the crayon scratched across the page. She handed the picture to Daniel before curling up on the couch. It was another image of Nixara, towering and monstrous, but this time she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a smaller figure, draped in shadow. A crude smile stretched across its blank face. "Who is this?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. Lily looked up at him, her glowing eyes dull and sad. "It's you, Daddy. She says you're hers now." Daniel stared out the window, the forest looming in the distance. The darkness didn't feel like a visitor anymore. It felt like home.